I'm Franz Payer with Cyber Skyline, and Cyber Skyline is the platform for the National Cyber League Games. This is Cyber Skyline Live. This is where we go over live how to solve different cybersecurity challenges, how to learn new cybersecurity skills. And this is really an opportunity for you to learn more about cybersecurity and give us feedback on what you'd love to learn more about. So we do these streams for you. If you've got suggestions for future episodes, please save them for the end. We're going to take recommendations at the end. If you're watching this as a pre-recorded video, welcome to you as well. And today we're going to be talking about how does binary work. So we're going to go straight into the slides and start talking about binary. So I've teleported my little icon over here. Hopefully you can still all see pretty well. And we're going to start first with, why does binary even exist? You've probably seen binary before, maybe in a movie, maybe you've heard about it in a TV show, and you've probably heard that computers like use binary, but maybe you don't know what that means. Well, what that actually means is that the computers use the binary system to save information. So the stuff that you see in the Matrix with all the ones and zeros going everywhere, it's a little bit fluff and it really doesn't mean anything. On the right side here, I got a screenshot from Futurama. That's actually like a message that is being written in binary. And that's a little bit more accurate for what binary is. Now, when we're talking about saving information, you might be wondering like what type of information. And really it's everything. It's text, it's photos, it's videos, it's PDFs, it's programs, anything from your iOS operating system to your Spotify app, even the colors that you're seeing on your screen. The computer needs to save that information. It needs to have that information so it can tell the monitor, this is what you're seeing, right? There's some green over here, there's some blue over here, maybe there's some red over here. Your computer needs to save all of that information in order to display it to you. And binary is a system that the computer is going to be using to keep track of all of this information. So before we dive into how a computer stores information, let's first answer the question, how are you as a human storing information? Because you aren't using ones and zeros, right? This isn't a trick question. In fact, I'm actually using a system right now just by talking to you. I'm speaking English, and in English, we form our ideas, we store our information by creating sentences. And these sentences are made up of words, and these words are made up of letters. And our letters collectively, those are the English alphabet. So hopefully this looks a little familiar to you. If you understand English, you probably have seen these characters before. If you speak Spanish, you're not using the English alphabet, you're using the Spanish alphabet. And if you speak Ukrainian, for example, you're using the Cyrillic alphabet, right? So we have different symbols, different ways to store information and represent information. Now, in each of these systems, whether it's English or whether it's Cyrillic, each of these characters represents a unique value. So A means something different than B. B means something different than C. We all know this, right? These are our building blocks. If you're combining multiple characters together, you can create a word. And once you have multiple words, you got a sentence. You can keep going even farther, right? Sentences, paragraphs, books, novels, trilogies. These are all being created. This is all information that is being stored by using these building blocks of the alphabet. And so the English alphabet is just a system for storing and representing information. And these characters are how we are representing that information. So another thing to keep in mind is that the A in English, it looks like there's also like an A in Cyrillic. I'm not very familiar with Cyrillic. I'm willing to bet they're not the same exactly. Like maybe it sounds a little bit different. Definitely putting an A in a word in Cyrillic is going to have a different meaning than putting an A in a word in English, for example. So really keep in mind that these characters themselves do not have meaning. They are just symbols. You could replace these with hieroglyphs, right? It's a symbol that is being used to convey that they are different values. The system, whether it's English or Cyrillic, it's the system that gives those values meaning. So again, English A different from a Cyrillic A. This is going to be helpful for us in the future, but I just want you to keep in mind that the character itself only has meaning when you put it in context of the system. So I'll refresh over this when we get further into the slides, but just keep that in mind. So we can store characters. What about numbers? Well, we have 10 characters to store number information. Hopefully you're also familiar with those. That's going to be your 0 through your 9. Those are all unique characters in our system. So that's 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Right? Like this. 10 characters, 9. We go from 0 to 9. That's 10 characters, not 9 characters. Make sure you're counting 0. So when you get from 9, you go to 10. A 10 is just a 1 and a 0, right? There are no unique characters past 9. This is called the decimal system. The DEC, the DEC, that I believe it's from Latin, meaning 10. So 10 different values in our number system. Now, this isn't the only system for storing numbers. There's other number systems. You might be also familiar with the Roman numeral system. It has its own set of characters. It works its own different way. These are just symbols, right? They're all different symbols. And it's the way that you interpret those symbols using a system that gives those symbols meaning. So why can't computers just store their information like humans do? And I'd say, yeah, it's been kind of working perfectly fine for us. Computers should be able to do that. If you add up the alphabet plus these 10 numbers, you're going to get 36 different characters. Why is that a problem? Well, the short answer is that actually that is too many characters. Humans are fortunate enough to be able to store information in our brains. I think it's a little bit, there's some science behind it. I don't think science has fully figured out exactly how memories are being stored in your brain, but I am pretty confident that if you just crack open someone's skull, their brain isn't going to have a bunch of English characters in it. Or like some sort of representation of English characters. But computers, they do need to physically store information. You could write English words on a piece of paper and store it that way, and that would be a physical way to store that information. And it's technically possible for you to create a computer that can read and write English characters on a piece of paper, but that's kind of complicated, right? Like, if you haven't built a machine before, like you're gonna have like these different sensors. How are you gonna be able to tell the difference between an A and a B? Like you're gonna have some sort of laser test to read it. It's really complicated, right? Like that's not an easy machine to build. There's gotta be an easier way to do that. And so this is where binary comes in. Binary only uses 2 different characters. So no more trying to identify 36 different values. The computer just needs to store 2 values, right? A 1 and a 0. So how is a computer actually going to be able to tell the difference between a 1 and a 0? The simple answer, I've got some screenshots here, is on-off switches. So back in the day of old computers, they used these vacuum tubes, which is what you're seeing in the picture on the left. It's these little electronic devices. It's actually not that little. They're actually pretty big. They could be, like like an inch tall. And each one of those is storing a 1 or a 0. If the tube is on, like in this yellow lit graphic, then that's a 1. If the tube is off, that is a 0. And so the computer can just send electricity to these tubes and use that to detect whether the vacuum tube is on or if it's off. Now, vacuum tubes aren't really used anymore. They're actually kind of big when you consider like how much information computers need to store nowadays. And if like every time you need to store a 1 or a 0, you need like this big tube to do that, you're not going to be able to store very much information at all. So we have better technology. There's better ways to simulate this on-off switch, but the tubes are like a cool way to visualize what's going on, because like all of the more modern ways of storing information are like microscopic. They're very hard to see, and this is a great way to visualize it. So we went through and we tried to think about how do we store information as humans, and then we looked at how computers are storing information. Let's do the same thing here with binary and counting. So before we start counting in binary, let's think about how do we as humans count normally. Well, we start first with a 0, and then we go all the way to 9, right? Very straightforward. So 9 is the last unique character that we have in our decimal system. What do we do when we need to count past the end of our last character? Well, once we hit 9, we have 10, right? 9, then 10. What we're doing now is we are using 2 digits. We reached the limit, we reached the end of how many characters, how many values we can represent with 1 character. And so now we have 2 characters. And I'm going to do a little bit of a throwback here to kindergarten and say that we're actually putting a 1 in the tens place, and we're putting a 0 in the ones place. And there's also a little bit of a secret here, and I'll say that technically we're not just putting a 1 in the tens place for no reason. There was actually a 0 in the tens place to begin with, so 9 is actually like 0, 9. But like humans don't really put the 0 in the front for no reason. Like that's not really necessary. But what we're doing right now, if you wanted to generalize this, is we are incrementing so when we reach the end of how many variables, how many values we can store with 1 character, we need to go to the next character. We increment that by 1, and then we reset our ones place, right? We incremented the zeros place, the tens place to become a 1, and we reset the ones place to be a 0. So now we've got 0, 9, instead of 0, 9 is now 1, 0, and that's 10. So every time we run out of characters, we just increment the next space, the next position, and then reset the last one. So what happens when we reach the end of the tens place and the ones place? And this is going to happen when we get to, I'm skipping ahead. So let's do this again with 19, right? When we get to 19, we're now at 20. We increment the tens place by 1, and we reset the ones place, and that will get us to 20. Now, when we get to the end of the tens, we are now at 99. So once we reached the end of the ones place going through 0 through 9, we reached the end of the tens place going through 0 to 9. Now we're at 99. What happens now? So at this point in time, we just do the same exact thing again. So we try to increment the 9 in the ones place. We realize we're out of space. So then we try to increment the 9 in the tens place. That's also out of space too. So we need to go one more. We go to the hundreds place. The hundreds place goes from a 0 to a 1. The tens place now has to get reset back to 0. The ones place also needs to get reset back to 0. And now we're at 100. 1, 0, 0. That's how we count, right? So when we go to 1,000, we're doing the exact same thing. We get to 999. We try to increase by 1. We find out that the 9 in the ones place is out. We run out of space because we reached 9 in the ones place. We run out of space because we reached 9 in the tens place. We've run out of space because we reached 9 in the hundreds place. So now we got to go to the thousands place, increase that by 1, and reset all the other ones. That's how we're counting. So hopefully that shouldn't be news. So now let's try to count using binary. We don't have 0 through 9 anymore. We only have 1 and 0. So we're going to start at 0, and then we're going to go to 1. All right? Same system that we had before. But now we run into our first problem, which is we're out, right? Because we only have 0, 1. There's no 2. we need a different way to do this. And so like we did before with decimal, we need to go to the next place, increment that, and then reset our ones place. So if we go to the next place, it's not the tens place, right? Because we didn't count to 10. We're only at 2. So like, what the heck is going on here? Well, it turns out that as you go to each subsequent place, the value of that place is 1 more than the maximum that you can store without using it. So when we're counting in decimal and we hit 9, the tens place is the tens place because that is 1 more than 9, which is the maximum value you can store without using the tens place. When we're doing binary, we have the ones place, but then the next place over is going to be the maximum value that we can store plus 1. So the maximum value that we can store is 1. 1 plus 1 is 2. We've got the twos place. So no tens place anymore. It's the twos place. So if we keep going this way, the way that we would represent 2 in binary is we do 1, 0. We increment the twos place, and then we reset the ones place. And then if we want to count 1 more, we try to increment the ones place again. We can. Now we're at 1, 1. This represents 3, right? So you take your cubes. I hope you all remember kindergarten with the little cubes, right? You've got your 2 cubes in the twos place, and you got your 1 cube in the ones place. You add up all your cubes together, you got 3 cubes. 1, 1 in binary is 3. All right, so we've now you should hopefully realize that now that we need to count beyond 3, we have the 4s place now, and we are at 1, 0, 0. We increment the 4s place by 1, we reset the 2s place, we reset the 1s place. All right, I'm going to stop here because this is typically where people get some confusion with accounting, and see if we've got any questions that we can answer here. Looks like most of the people asking questions are things that I'm going to answer at the end. So I will save those until later. And I'm going to continue here. But if you have any questions about how to count, hopefully you know how to count using 0 through 9. If you need help on how do we count using binary, ask those in the chat and we will stop by and take a look at those questions later. So we figured out how to count right now in hopefully decimal and binary. How do we actually read these numbers, right? Because counting cubes sounds like it's going to take forever. Turns out there's actually a formula for reading numbers. You might not even realize it when you're counting with decimal numbers, but if you do this very simple formula where you take the value of each digit and you multiply it by the value of its place, you can add them all together and get your final number. So, for example, we've got the number 1,337. In reality, this is 1,000 times 1, because there's a 1 in the 1,000s place, plus 100 times 3, because there's 3 in the hundreds place, and 10 plus 10 times 3, because there's 3 in the tens place, plus 1 times 7, because there's 7 in the ones place. So if I write this out, this is what it looks like, right? So you've got 1,000 times 1, 100 times 3, 10 times 3, 1 times 7. You add them all up, and that's 1,337. Now, you don't have to do all that math in your head because that's the exact same number that we just wrote down. So that's meaningless. But this is a little bit more helpful in number systems that are not our normal decimal system. If we want to do this with binary, the way that we would do this is the exact same way. So instead of having the thousands column and the hundreds column and the tens column and the ones column, instead we've got we've got the eights column, the fours column, the twos column, and the ones column. So Here's where I'm going to bring my little warning that I had at the beginning back up again, which is keep in mind this 10111 is not 1011 in right. We are right now we're counting in binary. So it's not 1011. We need to figure out like how many cubes is this actually, right? Because if you read 1011 as binary, it's not 1011. If you just look at the cubes, you can see here at the very left, we've got 8 cubes, right? And then we don't have any of the 4s. There's a 0 in the 4's place. Then we've got the 2's place. There's a 1 in the 2's place, so we have to count one set of those 2's. And then there's a 1 in the 1's place, right? So we've got the 8 cubes on the very left. We've got the 2 cubes, and then we got the 1 cube. If you count those all by hand, you're going to get 11. So clearly the answer is not 1011. It's just, in this case, it happens to just be 11. So let's use the formula. I'm going to write it in decimal, and I'm also going to write it in English. So it makes it a little bit easier to understand. So in decimal, this is 8 times 1 plus 4 times 0 plus 2 times 1 plus 1 times 1. That's 11. Written in English, it's 8 plus 0 plus 2 plus 1 equals 11. Take some time to process this. If it's not making very much sense to you, count the cubes and think about how you would do this if you count normally, right? So in binary, you can only store a 1 or a 0, so it actually makes counting the cubes really easy. If we go back to how we counted as like a kid in kindergarten, I only have pictured here 1 cube in the 1's place. But if you had 7 single cubes, like there would be 7 cubes there. In the 10's place, there's only 1 stick of 10. Because there's a 3 in the 10's column, it should be 3 sticks if you actually had those things physically. Same thing with the hundreds. There's a 3 in that hundreds place, but we only have 1 block of 100. If you were counting cubes, it would be 3 blocks of 100. So think about how you would do this in kindergarten. All right, so now we've got binary. We can use binary to represent numbers. We know how to count in binary. We know how to take a binary number and get the value of the binary number in decimal, because getting the value is really important. But you might be wondering, how does the computer store anything that isn't a number, right? Like, this is all really cool to store numbers, but there's a lot of things that computers do that are more than just numbers. Now, if you need to represent text, you can use something called the ASCII table. Now, the ASCII table is just a mapping of number values to English characters. So this is what the table looks like. It's not in binary. You can see here it's listed in decimal. And so, for example, if we're looking at the number 65, the number 65 is actually uppercase A in the ASCII table. And so the way that computers use numbers to represent these non-numeric values is they just have these different tables. And so the computer actually needs to keep track of, here's a bunch of numbers, and I need to interpret these bunch of numbers using a specific system. In this case, it's the ASCII table. There are other conversion tables out there. There's also Unicode, which can be used to represent emojis. So you can see here, like, there's no Chinese characters, there are no emojis, like all these other like characters that we see in text, they're not here in the ASCII table. And that's because there are additional conversion tables to increase the number of possible values. You can see here that the numbers go from 0 to 127. So that means you can represent all of these ASCII characters with just 128 different possible combinations. If you want to store more than 128 different characters, you're going to need more numbers, right? We have to go past 127. We're going to have to go like to the thousands or the tens of thousands or the hundreds of thousands, right? Because, what about the Chinese characters, Cyrillic, Greek characters, you want to put Latin characters in there. Like there's so many different other characters that we want to represent. And the way that you represent that is you just add more numbers, right? So maybe 128 could be a Cyrillic character, for example. You just keep going. And the different tables for these conversions have different purposes, right? ASCII was really helpful because it lets you store all this information in a very small number of characters. And remember, back in the day, computers were using these big, like these 1 inch tall, or like these little tubes, right? And so if you want to store more data, you got to make more tubes. And so it was actually more expensive to store more numbers. And if you think about even modern day right now, if you want to store more information, you need a bigger hard drive, right? Or maybe you need more hard drives. You need to pay more to store more data. Same problem back then, although it was way more expensive for them to store this information. And so ASCII, it's still really popular. It's like one of the major tables that was being used for representing characters. But now a lot of information is being stored using Unicode code, because Unicode goes way past 127 and it can store a lot more different characters. Now, when you're looking at past just text, you have things like files, for example. So maybe you have like a PNG or a JPEG or a PDF. The way those work is that each file, each one of those files is a file type, and each file type has a specification for how the computer should read the information for that file. So a file is literally just a ton of numbers, right? So if you actually think about like an image, for example, an image is just a bunch of numbers strung together, and it's got a start point and an end point. That's what the computer's storing, right? So if we're thinking back to the, I'm going to go back several slides. We're going back to our tube days. If we go back to these tubes, right? Let's just say we had thousands of these tubes, and each one of these tubes is either on or off. And to read the file, you would just go through all the tubes, and then you would use the specification to figure out how do you read this image. So let's just say, for example, this is completely like made up. I'm trying to oversimplify things. You've got a JPEG image. Maybe if you read the first, let's just say 8 tubes, the first 8 tubes, it represents how wide the photo is. So if we go to our binary over here, and we are, if we're looking over here, we only got 4 columns, but if we had 8 columns instead, maybe all 8 columns represents a number, and that number is how wide the photo is. So if we had, let's just say it was 00001011, right? So 4 zeros in the front, 1011, like we have in this example. Maybe that means that the photo is 11 pixels wide. And then the next 8 represents how tall it is, right? So if it's the same value, then it's 8 pixels wide, 8 pixels tall. And then maybe the next 8 represents what color the first pixel is. So let's just say that like the value 1 is blue, and the value 2 is green, and the value 3 is red. You're going to have a system that says that this number means this thing, this number means that thing. And that's actually like how all files work. They are just a series of numbers, and then there's a specification, which is a set of instructions that says how to read this huge chunk of numbers, right? You have to say, read this many digits. This many digits is a number. That number means this. The next set of digits is a number. That number means this. And you just keep going and going and going. If you wanted to save text in a number, and we're using the ASCII table, right? Maybe you read 8 of the tubes, and then you get the value for those 8 of the tubes. Say the value is 65, like in our example. Well, then there's an A in that position in the file. So if you were storing like a text file where it's just ASCII text, then that text file is just going to be a bunch of numbers, and you will read each one of those numbers by getting the value of like 8 tubes at a time, and converting that number into a character. Keep in mind that I'm choosing 8 as an example here. The specific file type is going to determine, do I use an ASCII table or do I use Unicode? Like, am I reading 8 tubes, or am I reading 16 tubes or 32 tubes? Like, how many tubes am I reading to get the value of one character? All of those are questions that are answered by the file type and by the specification, and the computer has all that information to facilitate that. So it's really cool. Like, at the end of the day, if you actually want to try it out, you could use a tool like hexdump and run hexdump on a file. You can take that file and convert it to binary again, and then like try to read the binary along with the specification. The specification might say read 1 byte. 1 byte is 8 binary characters, and then convert that byte into an ASCII character, and you can see, oh, there's an A in this file, and then there's a B. So that's actually like how the computer operates. It's all just numbers. So that was a lot of information. If that didn't make sense to you, there's a recording here. You might already be watching the recording. If you're watching this after the fact, feel free to go back, look at the example, look at the cubes. I'm going to go in and jump into the live questions that everyone's asking. And if you have a question, please make sure that you are using the Ask a Question feature in Crowdcast, because if you aren't, I might miss it. I might miss it if you just post it in the chat. So let's see what we've got in here. So Lizzie is asking, does it double going to infinity? Is there an upper limit? As in 256 is the biggest we can use because there's only 8-bit/digits. So Lizzie's asking for, how far do these numbers go? The numbers go to infinity just like they would normally. I think the reason why she might think that 256 here is the limit is because for kind of convenience, a lot of times the data gets split into 8-digit chunks, because you actually store very little information in a single digit in binary. So like a 1 digit in decimal can store 10 possible values. 1 digit in binary can only store 2. So if you were just like dealing with 1 digit at a time, you're not going to have anything meaningful to work with. So bytes are typically used as a unit of measurement in binary, and a byte is just 8 digits in one shot. And a cool thing about bytes, those 8 digits, is that they can be used to represent one ASCII character. So most text that's stored in ASCII is just, read 8 bytes or 8 bits. That's 1 byte, and then 1 byte is 1 character on the ASCII table. So if you want to keep going to infinity, you would just add more digits to the end of your number, right? Like if you really want to think about it, like your hard drive, your computer, or like a CD, like all of those devices that you use to store information, they are literally just storing massively long sequences of just ones and zeros, right? You could think of it as like one giant number. It probably wouldn't make sense to treat it as one giant number, because that one giant number, like on its own, doesn't mean anything. It only means things when you kind of chunk it out, right? So if you say, okay, the first 8 bits is 1 byte, and these 8 bits mean an A, and then the next 8 bits are another character, and that means a B. It's only helpful when you think about it that way. But technically, you can go infinity to infinity just like you would with decimal. All right, so let's jump over into a demo, and play around with this in the NCL gym. So this is a black screen right now. I'm going to get myself pulled up here. And so if you are accessing the gym, if you go to the cryptography module, you can see here that we've got some binary numbers. Now we have hexadecimal and base 64 messages in here. We're going to ignore those for now. Maybe we'll save that for another episode. We're just going to focus on this one binary question right here. And so we've got a challenge. There are some passwords that are being stored, and it appears they're being encoded using different number bases. This looks like binary. The way that we can kind of guess that it's binary is because it's only using ones and zeros. This is typically how you're going to identify what number system is being used. So if you see numbers that go from 0 to 9, probably means that it's decimal. If it is only zeros and ones, it's probably binary. There are number systems. If you read the PDF guide here, there's some additional examples like base 16, which is hexadecimal, and base 64, which is 64 possible values. That is a completely different discussion. Let me know in the chat if you all want a video about these other number bases other than binary, and we can cover that in a future episode. But right now, we're just going to focus on this one binary message. So what we need to do first is we need to convert these binary numbers into values. Now, let's start first by converting them into numbers. It looks like they are split up into 8 digits at a time, right? You can see there's 8 digits and then a space, 8 digits and then a space, 8 digits and then a space. That probably means that we want to convert these 8 digits into one number at a time. We don't want to convert the entire thing into one number in one shot. We want to break it up. So let's take these 8 digits. I don't really feel like doing this by hand. I'm actually going to go online and I'm just going to type in online binary to decimal converter. And if I type this in, I can put in my binary number and convert it to a decimal number. So this is decimal 115. So let's see if I can do like an online notepad. I can, cool. All right. So this is 115. So let's get our next character, our next number. So we're going to take this next set of digits, binary digits. We're going to go in here, convert it. This is 101. So if I take this, record this in here, 101. We go to our next one, plop it in my notepad, convert it. We have 99. And I'll just do one more. I'm going to take this in here, plop it in here. I have 117. 117. All right. I've got 4 numbers right now. Now that we have these 4 numbers in decimal, what do we do? Well, the prompt was telling us that these are passwords. So passwords should be like human readable text. So what we need to do right now is we need to convert these numbers into text. And I brought up that one of the ways that you can do that is using the ASCII table. And so if I go pull up the ASCII table, we can come here and we can do the conversion. Let me see if I can find one that is just decimal, because sometimes they use multiple different. Cool. All right. So we have the ASCII table, and you can see here, here is the number, the value, and on the right of the number is the character that number represents. So if we go back to our notepad, we can see here that the first one is 105. So if I go to the ASCII table and sorry, not 105, 115. If I go here and I look up 115, this is a lowercase s. And if I go to the next one, 101, this is a lowercase e. And I go to the next one, this is a lowercase c. And then 117, this is a lowercase u. So you can see now that we're converting these binary numbers into some text, right? Something that we can actually read. That's how the computers are storing it, right? So the computer, if you're typing your, hopefully, hopefully your computer isn't storing your password in plain text. Hopefully it's encrypted. But if you typed out your plain text in a notepad and you hit save, your computer is storing your password in binary as these ones and zeros. And then there's a lookup table to convert these ones and zeros back into the password that you typed. Pro tip, don't type your password into Notepad. It's a terrible idea. Now, this seems really tedious. I don't really want to do this for the rest of the password. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go and type in online binary to ASCII converter. So I don't have to do this by hand for every single one. And if I go and use this online converter, I hit convert, and that looks like some text that could be a password. And I can go in here and hit enter. So that's how we solved that challenge, right? Really cool way to understand like how this is working. Like if you really think about it, like back decades ago, this information, this text, the securely was being stored using these like vacuum tubes, which is like turned on or off. And then now we have technology so that we don't have to use vacuum tubes. We've got like flash drives, we've got CDs, which we're not even really using anymore. Like we have solid state drives. We have all this new cool technology that uses like fancy science and physics to store this information instead of like old vacuum tubes. But that's all that's happening at the end of the day. Everything that your computer's storing, whether that's photos, the color in each pixel in those photos, the width and the height of those photos, like those are all just numbers, and it's storing it in like a giant list of just like ones and zeros all back to back. And the computer just basically has to keep track of like, this is where one begins and where one ends, right? So this file begins here, this file ends here. When I want to read this file, I go from here to here and I send that information and I follow, then I'll use a program which knows how to read that file, and it will use the specification of that file type to say, this is an image file, these numbers are the width, these numbers are the height, these numbers are the colors of the different pixels. And then there's some other program, some other software which will tell the computer how to show those colors on the screen. It's really cool. So if you, I hope you found that valuable. I personally had a lot of fun making this. I was a little bit nostalgic for me to go back to kindergarten and use the little cubes. If you want to show your siblings or your parents like, hey, you can count in binary, those cubes are fun. I would definitely like recommend trying to make it tactile. A lot of like tech and cyber is like super theoretical. It's not very tactile. You have a lot of like ones and zeros and you're like, what does that mean? And it's just like ones and zeros are just tubes that can turn on or off. You can even think of it as an on or off light bulb. And when I need to convert binary into decimal, like I need to go back to kindergarten. And instead of thinking about like the sticks of 1, 10, 100, and 1,000, I'm doing sticks of 1, 2, 4, 8, 16. It's the same mechanism for counting, the same way for using numbers, but this is a system that is way easier for the computer. The computer can keep track of 2 different values way easier than it can even 10 values. So that's why computers use binary, and that's how you can use binary and understand what the computer is doing. So I appreciate you all for joining. I'm going to go through and make sure that there are no final questions, but for those of you who are watching the post recording, best of luck for you all. Good luck in the gym. If you want to check out additional videos that we have, you can go to the YouTube channel here. Just click on the video and go to the channel. We've got a whole playlist of all of our past videos that you can go and check out. And happy hunting for those of you who are in the post recording.